Hi guys, this is Mr. Hefner, and this is the video version of the introduction to the nonfiction unit that I normally do in class. If you missed class, this video will be a good way to make that up. And even if you were in class and you would like to review before the end of the unit, it's not a bad idea to take a look at these videos a second time. Now, this is going to be the nonfiction unit. We did fiction some time ago, and we know that the word fictio means something invented. So nonfiction is going to mean something that's not invented, but we'll cover that again later. On these slides, if you see an icon that looks like a Cornell note sheet, you're going to either see a red bar across the page or you're going to see a blue circle around the page. When you see the red bar, that means you don't need to take Cornell notes on this particular page of the presentation because there's nothing here that you're going to be expected to remember or be tested on. So we're going to get started with the nonfiction unit right now. The unit essential questions that we're going to, oh, by the way, there's that little bouncing Cornell Notes page. You notice there's no red bar across the page. So in this particular case, it means that you should be taking Cornell Notes. And just remember, this is a video. You can pause the video while you take notes. You can speed it up if you're just listening, or you could slow it down if you're taking notes, although that will make my voice sound kind of funny. It's probably best to pause after each bullet point to take any notes you need to take. So our first essential question is going to be, what are the different forms of nonfiction? We'll talk about what forms are later, but if you're taking Cornell notes, forms is a good word right now to write in that cues section of your Cornell note sheet, that left-hand column. Write that in the left-hand column and then leave space in the telegraphic notes part for an explanation. We're going to talk about the various purposes of nonfiction. We talked about purposes of fiction when we did that unit, and nonfiction is also going to have varied purposes. We're going to take a look at the different modes of nonfiction. Now, modes is kind of a funny word. It has to do with sort of the way your brain is working and the strategies that you're using as you write. And then we're going to take a look at the many, many types of writing that are used in nonfiction. So again, if you're taking Cornell notes, maybe you want to pause for a second, add the words that you see in blue in your cues section of your note sheet, and when you're ready, hit play and we'll go on. All right, let's talk about those types of nonfiction. Histories, anything that's recording something from the past counts as a history. And so there are many things in that category. Famous speeches. In one of my classes, we read Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. In this class, we're going to read the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. These are all nonfiction. They're not something invented. They're about what's going on in the world. But today we still read them because they give us insight into what times were like back at that time. Now in school we don't do a lot of sermons because they're religious, but there are a few that have had major influence on Western literature. When you get to 11th grade American Lit, you will read a very famous sermon by a guy by the name of Jonathan Edwards, who in the early days of America wrote a sermon that sort of changed the way people thought about God and worshiped and things like that in this country. Contracts sounds like, well, who would read a contract except a lawyer? But there are some famous ones. If you go back, you probably studied in American history, you talked about something called the Mayflower Compact. Now, they called that a compact, but that's another word for a contract. It was an agreement on how the people of the Mayflower would live and work together. And we have deeds and constitutions and certain laws. You know, we talk about things like the First Amendment and the Second Amendment all the time, and in a way that makes them literature. Biographies and autobiographies. We're going to take a look at least one of each in this unit. Biographies, that word bio, life, graph means write. It's a writing about someone's life. And an autobiography is also a writing about someone's life, but you have that word auto, which means self. And so in this case, the writing was done by a person about themselves. Letters, diaries, and journals. Everybody's heard of the Diary of Anne Frank, for instance. We know what letters are. Hopefully we've all written letters or received a letter from someone at some time. There are very famous ones that have made it into literature. We have the letters that went back and forth between John Adams and Abigail Adams. We have the Diary of Anne Frank, as I mentioned. And the primary difference between a diary and a journal is that diaries tend to be written by a person. They're very personal, and the primary audience is the writer. Journals, on the other hand, are generally written with the idea that someone else will read them someday. So while they may still be personal, they're often about observations of things going on in the world around that person. We have essays. If you've ever picked up a newspaper and read an editorial, every editorial is a type of essay. And then we have articles. And probably, we know that about 80% of all the material that gets published each year is nonfiction. I would guess that maybe 80% of that 80% is articles. You pick up any newspaper and mostly what you're seeing is articles. Now, these modes of nonfiction that I mentioned a little bit earlier, funny kind of word. We're going to simplify this, but this chart comes right out of your textbook. So let's go through what the chart is first. So the first mode that your textbook gives you is expository/informative. This is writing that's used to inform. It's probably the most common type of writing that there is. And when you're in school, almost everything that you're reading falls into this category. We're just going to use the word informative. We're going to avoid expository to simplify things. We're going to take all of these modes and we're going to bring them down to just 3. We have imaginative writing. You might think that, well, isn't that fiction? Yeah, fiction is imaginative, but you can also do imaginative writing in nonfiction. So, for example, you might have something like a funny anecdote, something that happened to me the other day that's made to entertain. You might have a poem that is really about something in the world going on at that time. Narrative writing is any time you're telling a story in chronological order. If that story is made up, that would make it fiction. But if it's a true story, then it's nonfiction. There's the personal and expressive, and again, this could be a diary, it could be a narrative. These things sort of cross over at various places. And then we have the persuasive or the argumentative, and this is where you're trying to convince someone to take up a position or agree with you. All right, now I said what we were going to do is we're going to simplify this. We're just going to think of the modes as narrative, persuasive, and informative. And that's because those are the 3 modes that the state of Pennsylvania has been using when they've tested you. You remember way back in middle school when you were doing PSSAs. Those were the 3 modes of writing that were tested at some point in the PSSAs. And then there's types of writing. There's narration. That's where you have someone telling a story. And in narration, you sometimes have dialogue. That's when you have more than one speaker. You have description, and of course, you know what description is. I'm going to catch up here. I fell behind there a little bit. You have description, which is when you're trying to paint a sensory image of something, what it looks like, what it smells like, what it sounds like, and not too many times what it tastes like, unless you're a restaurant reviewer. And then we have exposition. And exposition is a type of informative writing where you're sort of taking things apart, studying them, analyzing them, breaking them down, comparing and contrasting. This is where you're doing nonfiction writing at a higher intellectual level. All right, there's probably a little bit more to do today. If you look on Schoology, you might find some additional assignments, so be sure to take a look at that, get that completed, and I thank you for staying with me through the entire presentation.